He thought it would be funny to embarrass her in front of everyone, but he had no idea he was about to silence the loudest gym in town. The Saturday afternoon class at Iron Forge Martial Arts was packed wall to wall, the air thick with the smell of rubber mats and determination, as Brad Hoffman, a well-known black belt with a reputation as sharp as the creases in his uniform, stood at the center of the mat soaking in the attention of nearly 30 students lined up along the walls. At 6 feet tall and built like someone who measured his progress in plates added to a barbell, Brad thrived on being the strongest presence in the room. And when the door opened, and Emily Carter stepped inside, wearing plain gray leggings and a loose t-shirt, her light brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail, she barely registered as a blip on his radar. She looked like someone who had wandered in from the yoga studio next door, not someone prepared to train under fluorescent lights buzzing above a 1,200 square foot mat. A few students glanced at her, then at each other, subtle smirks passing between them as she quietly removed her sneakers and placed them neatly against the wall. Brad noticed the hesitation in her step, the way she surveyed the room without trying to claim space, and something in him decided this was an opportunity. "You here for the beginner cardio class?" he called out, his voice carrying easily across the gym. A ripple of laughter followed. Emily offered a polite smile. "I'm here for the 3 p.m. session," she replied, her tone steady but soft. Brad raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a fitness club," he said, pacing slowly in a half-circle around her, as if presenting her to an audience. "We train serious fighters here." The words weren't shouted, but they were deliberate, designed to entertain. A couple of students shifted, clearly enjoying the show. Someone in the back whispered, "This should be interesting." Emily didn't fire back. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, as if the room's temperature hadn't changed at all. Brad stretched his shoulders dramatically, glancing at the group. "Tell you what," he said with a grin that suggested this was all harmless fun. "We'll do a quick demonstration. Nothing crazy. Just so you can see what real training looks like." More laughter. A phone lifted discreetly, ready to record. Emily's gaze lifted to meet his for the first time, calm and unreadable, and for a split second something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the quiet before a summer storm rolls across an open field. Brad mistook it for nerves. He stepped back onto the center logo printed on the mat and gestured for her to join him. "Don't worry," he added, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. "I'll go easy." The class tightened its circle, sneakers squeaking against rubber as everyone leaned in just a little closer. What Brad saw was a simple woman who had walked into the wrong room. What he didn't see was the stillness in her breathing, the way her posture aligned without effort, the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need applause to measure strength. He thought he was about to entertain the crowd. He didn't realize the crowd was about to witness a lesson in humility they would never forget. Brad rolled his neck slowly as the circle tightened around the center mat, the low hum of the ceiling fans mixing with the faint squeak of rubber soles shifting into position. He thrived in this kind of spotlight, in the subtle electricity that came when people expected a performance. He motioned for Emily to step closer, and she did without hesitation, stopping about 3 feet in front of him, her hands relaxed, her shoulders loose. From the outside, she looked like someone who had agreed to something she might regret. Brad interpreted her calm as uncertainty. "We will keep it simple," he announced to the class, folding his arms for a moment before settling into a ready stance. "Just basic movement. Nothing complicated." His tone carried the faint edge of condescension that had become second nature to him. A few students nodded, eager, their expressions suggesting they were about to watch a quick lesson in hierarchy. Emily adjusted her footing slightly, not dramatically, just enough to align herself squarely with him. She inhaled once, slow and measured, and exhaled as if she were settling into a familiar rhythm. One of the newer students whispered, "She looks nervous." Another replied under his breath, "This will be over fast." Brad stepped lightly from side to side, demonstrating agility, his movements broad enough to draw attention, controlled enough to signal superiority. He extended a hand in a mock courteous gesture. "Ready?" he asked, the grin still present. Emily gave a small nod. "I am ready." There was no tremor in her voice. Brad moved first, not aggressively, but with a quick forward step meant to test her reaction time. Emily shifted just enough to the side, that his momentum carried him a fraction farther than he expected. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it caused him to recalibrate. A few students exchanged glances. Brad circled again, slightly faster now, tapping the mat with the ball of his foot, attempting to draw her into overreacting. She did not chase him. She did not lunge. She simply pivoted smoothly, maintaining distance with an ease that did not match her supposed inexperience. The air in the room began to change, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The laughter that had floated so freely minutes earlier faded into attentive silence. Brad attempted another quick advance, expecting hesitation. Instead, he found himself gently redirected off his line of movement, his balance disrupted not by force, but by precision. It was controlled, measured, and entirely deliberate. A faint crease formed between his eyebrows. Emily's expression remained composed, almost thoughtful, as if she were solving a familiar equation rather than engaging in a public challenge. Someone near the back lowered their phone slightly. The performance was not unfolding the way they anticipated. Brad reset his stance, this time with less flourish and more focus. He studied her posture more carefully, noticing details he had overlooked before, the even distribution of her weight, the way her hands hovered at exactly the right height, the absence of wasted motion. For the first time since she had stepped onto the mat, he stopped smiling. The room, once buzzing with expectation of entertainment, grew quiet enough that the faint ticking of the wall clock near the entrance could be heard. And in that stillness, the balance of power began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Brad adjusted his stance again, this time without theatrics, the playful edge completely gone from his posture as he began to understand that the woman standing across from him was not reacting the way beginners usually did. Beginners flinched. Beginners rushed. Beginners made mistakes born from nerves. Emily made none. She moved only when necessary, each adjustment small and economical, as though she had rehearsed this exact distance 1,000 times before. Brad stepped forward with a sharper feint, attempting to draw out a response, expecting at least a stumble or a delayed reaction. Instead, Emily rotated smoothly, guiding his forward energy past her center line with a light touch that looked effortless yet impossibly precise. There was no forceful shove, no dramatic clash, just a redirection so clean that it left Brad momentarily off balance and forced him to reset his footing. A quiet murmur passed through the students lining the mat. Someone who had been whispering earlier now stood completely still. The confidence Brad had relied on began to shift into calculation. He circled again, more cautious now, studying her eyes. They were not wide with panic. They were focused, steady, almost patient. He attempted another controlled advance, this time faster, expecting to overwhelm her timing. Emily stepped in rather than away, closing the gap in a way that surprised him, her movement subtle but decisive. In one fluid sequence, she adjusted her position and guided him downward into a controlled kneeling stance on the mat without impact or struggle, her balance perfectly centered while his weight shifted unexpectedly beneath him. The motion was so efficient that for a second it looked rehearsed, like a demonstration between long-time training partners rather than a spontaneous challenge. Brad found himself on one knee, not hurt, not thrown, simply placed there by technique he had not anticipated. The entire gym fell silent. The sound of the ceiling fan seemed louder than before. A student near the wall slowly lowered his phone completely. Emily released her hold immediately and stepped back, offering space rather than dominance. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply waited, hands relaxed again at her sides. Brad rose carefully, brushing his palm against the mat as if confirming what had just happened was real. His face no longer carried amusement. It carried recognition. He tried once more, this time with full focus, but the outcome was the same. Each attempt met with calm precision. Each movement redirected, neutralized, and answered without excess. Within moments, the energy in the room had transformed entirely. What began as entertainment had turned into instruction. The hierarchy everyone assumed was fixed had quietly dissolved in front of them. Brad stepped back fully now, breathing heavier than before, not from exertion alone, but from realization. Across from him stood a woman who had never needed the spotlight to define her strength. And for the first time that afternoon, no one in the room felt like laughing. Brad remained standing at the center of the mat, but the authority he had carried so confidently earlier now felt thinner, as if something invisible had been peeled away. The students around the perimeter did not shift or whisper this time. They watched in stillness, absorbing what they had just seen. Emily's posture had not changed. She stood as she had from the beginning, shoulders relaxed, breathing even, eyes steady but not challenging. There was no triumph in her expression, only composure. Brad cleared his throat softly, the sound unusually loud in the quiet room. "Where did you train?" he asked, his voice no longer edged with sarcasm. It was a real question now. Emily paused for a moment before answering, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Different places," she said simply. "For a long time." There was no list of accolades, no dramatic reveal, just a statement of fact delivered without performance. Brad studied her again, seeing details he had overlooked before. The way her stance naturally aligned, the way her center of gravity never drifted, the absence of tension in her hands. These were not beginner habits. These were the habits of someone who had spent years refining control. A student near the wall finally spoke, his voice quiet but sincere. "That was clean." Others nodded. Not loudly, not dramatically, just acknowledgement. Brad took a slow breath and stepped forward, but this time not in challenge. He extended his hand respectfully. "I misjudged you," he admitted. The words did not come easily, but they came clearly. Emily accepted the handshake without hesitation. "It happens," she replied. There was no accusation in her tone, no lingering resentment, just calm understanding. The tension that had once fueled the room dissolved into something else entirely. A lesson had taken place, and everyone knew it. Brad turned toward the class, scanning the faces that had once shared in the laughter. "Strength is not about volume," he said quietly. "It is about control." The statement felt less like instruction and more like realization. Emily stepped back toward the edge of the mat, blending once again into the line of students, just as she had when she first arrived. But the way the others looked at her now had changed. There was no smirk, no dismissal, only respect. The ceiling fans continued their steady hum above the 12-foot ceiling. The afternoon light filtered through the front windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor near the entrance. Everything looked the same as before, yet the atmosphere had shifted completely. Brad clapped his hands once, signaling the class to reset. "Line up," he said, his tone firm but measured. This time, when he glanced at Emily, it was not to entertain the room at her expense. It was to acknowledge a practitioner who had earned her place without raising her voice. And in that quiet recognition, the gym learned something far more valuable than any technique demonstrated that day. The class resumed, but nothing felt routine anymore. The usual rhythm of call and response, the sharp commands, the synchronized footwork across the 1,200 square feet of mat all carried a different weight. Brad moved through the drills with steady focus, demonstrating combinations without exaggeration, correcting posture with calm precision rather than showmanship. Each time he gave instruction, his tone held something new, a measured humility that had not been there before. The students followed closely, their earlier amusement replaced with concentration. Emily blended seamlessly into the line, mirroring each movement with quiet efficiency, never drawing attention to herself, yet impossible to ignore. When partners rotated for controlled practice rounds, a subtle hesitation passed through the group. No one joked this time. No one whispered. Instead, one by one, they approached her with respect, offering small nods before beginning. She guided each exchange with the same calm restraint she had shown earlier, adjusting angles gently, correcting timing with a light touch, offering brief, thoughtful feedback when asked. It became clear that her skill was not situational. It was foundational. After nearly 40 minutes, Brad called the class to a close. The wall clock near the entrance ticked past 4 o'clock as students lined up once more, sweat dampening the edges of their uniforms, breathing steady but satisfied. Brad stood in front of them, hands clasped behind his back. He looked at the group, then at Emily. "Today was a reminder," he said quietly. "Never assume you know someone's limits by how they walk through the door." No one disagreed. The lesson required no repetition. As the class bowed out, the usual chatter returned, but softer, reflective. A young woman who had laughed earlier approached Emily, her voice tentative. "I am sorry," she said simply. Emily smiled gently. "You do not need to be." We all learn. Across the room, Brad gathered his bag but did not leave immediately. He watched as Emily slipped her sneakers back on and tied them with unhurried movements. When she reached the door, he stepped forward. "If you are open to it," he said, his voice steady, "I would like you to teach a session next week. The advanced group could benefit." The offer was not performative. It was sincere. Emily paused, considering, then gave a small nod. "I would be glad to help." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, the air crisp and clear. As she walked to her car, there was no dramatic exit, no triumphant glance back through the glass doors. Inside the gym, Brad stood for a moment longer, replaying the afternoon in his mind. The laughter, the silence, the shift, strength, he realized, was not proven by volume or dominance. It was revealed through control, through patience, through the quiet confidence of someone who did not need an audience. And from that day forward, the loudest sound in Iron Forge martial arts was not boasting or mockery. It was respect earned in stillness. The following week arrived with a different kind of anticipation humming beneath the surface of Iron Forge martial arts. Word had traveled quietly through text messages and casual conversations that the woman from Saturday would be leading the advanced session. By 3 o'clock, the 1,200 square feet of mat were filled again, but this time the energy was focused rather than amused. Brad stood near the back wall instead of at the center, arms folded, not as the authority of the room, but as a student willing to observe. When Emily stepped through the door, dressed in a simple fitted training top and dark athletic pants, her hair pulled back neatly, no one laughed. Conversations softened. Several students straightened instinctively. She walked to the center logo without hesitation, her steps measured and unhurried, as though she had always belonged there. She faced the class and offered a small nod. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice calm but clear enough to carry across the room without strain. "Today is about control and awareness." There was no boast in her tone, no reference to what had happened days before. She did not need to mention it. Everyone remembered. She started with footwork drills, subtle shifts of weight that seemed almost too simple at first. A few students exchanged uncertain looks, expecting something dramatic. But within minutes, they realized how much precision the basics required. She corrected posture gently, adjusting an elbow here, a shoulder there, explaining how efficiency conserved energy over time. "Power without control wastes effort," she said, demonstrating how a slight pivot could redirect momentum smoothly. Brad watched closely, recognizing the depth behind her simplicity. She paired students strategically, encouraging them to feel balance rather than force. The room grew quieter with each round, not out of tension but concentration. Even the ceiling fans seemed less noticeable as the class absorbed her steady instruction. At one point, she invited Brad to join her at the center for a demonstration. A few eyes widened, but there was no mockery in the air this time. They moved together fluidly, each action measured, each response deliberate. There was no competition, only collaboration. When the sequence ended, the students broke into spontaneous applause, not loud or chaotic, but genuine. Emily stepped back immediately, allowing the focus to return to the group. As the hour drew to a close, she gathered everyone in a line. "The strongest person in the room is the one who does not need to prove it," she said softly. The statement settled over the class like a quiet truth. When the session ended, students approached her with questions, not out of curiosity alone, but respect. Brad waited until the room cleared before speaking. "You changed this place," he admitted. Emily shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "You were ready to change." Outside, the late afternoon sky glowed pale gold over the parking lot, casting long shadows that stretched across the asphalt. Inside the gym, something lasting had shifted. Not the equipment, not the walls, but the atmosphere. From that day forward, laughter in that room would never again come at the expense of someone underestimated. And strength would be measured not by how loudly it announced itself, but by how quietly it stood its ground. 2 months later, the rhythm inside Iron Forge martial arts felt entirely different from the day Emily first stepped through its doors. The laughter that once echoed too loudly had been replaced by focused conversation and the steady sound of disciplined movement across the mat. The class roster had grown by nearly 15 new members. Many of them women who had heard through quiet word of mouth that this was a place where skill mattered more than appearance. Brad noticed the change every time he unlocked the front door at 2:45 in the afternoon, the sunlight cutting across the polished floor in long golden lines as students filtered in with genuine anticipation rather than idle curiosity. Emily now taught one advanced session each week, and she never entered with spectacle. She carried a simple gym bag, nodded to whoever met her eyes, and stepped onto the mat, as if stepping into a space of responsibility rather than performance. On this particular Saturday, the air felt crisp outside, the temperature hovering just under 60 degrees, and inside the gym the atmosphere carried a calm confidence that had been earned, not announced. Brad stood near the entrance watching as Emily guided a small group through balanced drills, her voice steady and measured. "Slow down," she reminded them gently. "Control is built in inches, not miles." Students listened carefully, adjusting their footing by fractions rather than feet, understanding now that refinement lived in the details. After the session ended, one of the younger members approached Brad privately. "I almost quit that first week," he admitted quietly. "I thought this place was just about showing off. It feels different now." Brad nodded, absorbing the weight of that statement. He remembered clearly the version of himself who had thrived on being the loudest presence in the room. That version felt distant now. Later that afternoon, as the last students gathered their belongings, Emily remained behind to wipe down the mats with the same unassuming diligence she had shown from the beginning. Brad joined her, handing over a clean towel without speaking at first. Finally he said, "You could open your own studio. People would follow you." Emily smiled slightly, not dismissing the idea, but not chasing it either. "It is not about being followed," she replied. "It is about building something steady." The words lingered long after the lights were dimmed and the doors were locked. Weeks turned into months, and the gym continued to evolve. New students were welcomed without judgment. Demonstrations were collaborative rather than competitive. Corrections were offered without humiliation. Brad found himself repeating phrases he had once heard from Emily, reminding students that strength did not need an audience to be valid. On a quiet evening as the sun dipped below the row of brick storefronts across the parking lot, Brad stood alone at the center of the mat for a moment, reflecting. The echo of earlier days felt like a lesson preserved in memory. He understood now that leadership was not measured by how easily others could be impressed, but by how willingly one could learn. And in the stillness of that empty gym, he recognized that the most powerful shift had not been physical at all. It had been the transformation of ego into respect, of noise into purpose, and of a single underestimated woman into the quiet standard that redefined what true strength looked like. By early spring, Iron Forge Martial Arts no longer felt like the same place it had been that first Saturday afternoon. The walls had not changed. The 1,200 square feet of mat were the same shade of deep charcoal. The heavy bags still hung in a neat row along the east wall. But the atmosphere carried a steadiness that had been carefully built, class by class, correction by correction. Emily continued to teach once a week, and her sessions were now the most consistently attended on the schedule. Students arrived 15 minutes early, stretching quietly, reviewing footwork patterns, speaking in low tones rather than restless chatter. Brad noticed how different the room sounded before she even stepped through the door. It was not silent out of fear. It was quiet out of respect. On one particular Saturday, a new student entered the gym just as Emily was setting down her bag near the edge of the mat. He was tall, confident, and clearly accustomed to being noticed. He wore a crisp uniform, his movements deliberate, his expression scanning the room as if assessing it. A few months earlier, Brad might have welcomed that energy with competition. Instead, he watched calmly. The young man approached Emily with a slight tilt of his chin. "I have trained at several competitive studios," he said, his tone neutral but edged with expectation. "I am curious how you run things here." There was no mockery in his voice, but there was assumption. The room felt the subtle shift. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "We focus on control," she replied evenly, "and we let skill speak for itself." She invited him to join the warm-up. The drills began slowly, emphasizing balance, breath, and alignment. The new student moved quickly at first, attempting to add intensity where precision was required. Emily observed without interruption. After several minutes, She stepped beside him and demonstrated the same sequence with less motion and more efficiency. The difference was unmistakable. He adjusted, not because he was corrected harshly, but because the example was undeniable. As the class progressed into partner work, the young man found himself recalibrating again and again, discovering that force alone did not determine outcome. There was no dramatic moment, no public lesson delivered in sharp words, just steady refinement that reshaped his approach within an hour. When the session ended, he approached Emily quietly. "I understand," he said simply. She nodded once. "Good." Across the mat, Brad felt a quiet sense of pride, not in dominance, but in the culture that had taken root. He remembered the version of himself who once relied on volume and spectacle. That memory felt distant now, almost foreign. The gym had become a place where strength was demonstrated through patience, where newcomers were guided rather than tested for entertainment. As the students filtered out into the bright afternoon light, Emily lingered briefly near the entrance. The parking lot shimmered under the sun, and the air carried the faint scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby field. She looked back once at the emptying space, not to claim it, but to appreciate the work that had been done quietly within it. Iron Forge martial arts had not been transformed by force or confrontation. It had been reshaped by composure, by example, and by the steady presence of someone who never needed to prove her strength to possess it. Summer settled over the town with long stretches of golden light pouring through the front windows of Iron Forge martial arts, warming the mats before the first class even began. Nearly a year had passed since the afternoon that quietly reshaped everything, and the transformation no longer felt new. It felt permanent. The gym's reputation had spread beyond its zip code, not because of flashy promotions or aggressive marketing, but because people talked. They talked about the atmosphere, about the respect, about the way newcomers were met, with guidance instead of judgment. On a bright Saturday morning, as the temperature outside climbed toward 80 degrees, Brad unlocked the doors at 8:30 and paused for a moment before turning on the lights. He listened to the stillness of the room, remembering the version of himself who once measured leadership by applause. That memory felt distant, like an echo from a smaller space. By 9 o'clock, students filtered in steadily, greeting one another with easy familiarity. Emily arrived a few minutes later, offering the same modest nod she had on her very first day. She had never claimed ownership of the culture that grew around her example, yet everyone understood the role she had played. During the advanced session that morning, Brad invited her to address the class at the end. She stepped forward, hands relaxed, eyes steady, and looked at the line of students who now stood taller not because they were stronger, but because they were more aware. "You will always meet someone who surprises you," she said calmly. "When that happens, let it teach you instead of threaten you." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voice, just clarity. After class, a young girl no older than 12 approached Emily with her mother, her uniform slightly oversized, her expression shy but determined. "I want to train here," the girl said softly. "It feels safe." Emily smiled gently. "Then you belong here," she replied. Brad watched that exchange from across the mat, understanding fully what had changed. Safety had replaced spectacle. Discipline had replaced ego. As the day wound down and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, Emily gathered her bag once more. She did not linger for recognition. She never had. At the doorway, she turned briefly toward the gym floor where students were laughing lightly while wiping down the mats together, not at one another, but with one another. Brad caught her glance and gave a simple nod of gratitude. She returned it and stepped outside into the warm air. Inside, the fans hummed steadily beneath the high ceiling, and the space felt grounded, balanced. Strength no longer needed to announce itself within those walls. It stood quietly, practiced daily, measured in patience and humility. And in that gym, on that corner of town, the loudest lesson ever taught had been delivered without a shout, proving that the deepest power is the kind that does not need to be seen to be understood.